Welcome to Exhuming the Truth, the podcast that is dedicated to cold cases, missing persons, systemic injustices, and the art of forensic science that seeks answers when silence remains. My name is Asha Carmody, and I am a forensic scientist and a criminologist, and in each episode, we examine the evidence, the systems, and the human stories that are often left behind. This is not just about true crime, it's about the truth. It's about accountability, and it's about giving a voice to those who deserve to be heard. Thank you so much for being here, and let's jump right in. Hello guys, and welcome back to another episode of Exhuming the Truth. I hope you've been enjoying a little bit of a shake-up here with our Field Notes season. So all of the Field Notes episodes are going to go into season 3, and then we have another special series/season coming. Sorry, my voice just broke. How weird. Which is going to go into season 4, but we'll chat about that a bit later. I got a lot of really great feedback from our episodes with Chris Darcy, which I expected because he just came in like full guns blazing, had so much information to share, and I was a sponge, and it sounds like everybody else was when listening to his episode, so it was really inspiring, and I'm really glad that you guys also enjoyed that. Now, we did do an episode on the Strongsville crash, which is the Netflix documentary, the crash of Mackenzie Shirilla driving her vehicle into a brick building and killing her then boyfriend Dominique Russo and then passenger Davion Flanagan. Now, I was tonight going to do part 2 of that. However, something else came up in the news today, and I thought I am going to do this first, so you will get that maybe Thursday. I might do it and in video format as well, but I thought I'm going to cover this because it's something a little different. It's a case that we are all quite familiar with and one that I have covered before, but it's a little bit of a different side to that case. So today we are talking about the Claremont serial killer, Bradley Edwards, and what was found inside his house when he was arrested. Now, believe it or not, this is actually a question that has fascinated people ever since the arrest of Bradley Edwards, and people really want to know what was inside that house. And this is a question that appears repeatedly online. I've been reading it all afternoon. What was in there? People imagining things like, hidden rooms and trophies and secret collections and all of these ridiculously wild things that you would see on like a Hollywood crime thriller. But the reality is actually very interesting, and it falls heavily on the criminological side of what I do, and it teaches us something really important about modern forensic investigations, and that's that sometimes what investigators don't find is equally as significant as what they do. And I've gone on about this quite a lot, and this is a perfect example. So let's just get straight into it. On December 22nd, 2016, police arrested Bradley Robert Edwards at his home in Kewdale, Western Australia. Now, by this point, investigators had spent years quietly re-examining evidence connected to the disappearance and murders of Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, and Ciara Glennon. Now, the Claremont investigation had become one of Australia's largest and most complex cold cases, and for 2 decades, Bradley Edwards had remained unidentified in a way. And then there were the obvious advances in science, and particularly forensic science, which changed everything because police moved in to arrest Edwards. And in doing that, they also executed an extensive search with a search warrant that they had for his home address. Now, naturally, the public want answers, right? And they want to know, what has the police come across, or what have they found? Have they uncovered some horrifying secret, or like some, tell-all journal that you expect to see after watching all these ridiculous CSI shows? But the answer might surprise you, and I'm going to tell you exactly what they seized. Now, during the search, investigators removed numerous items from his property. Now, one item would later become important was a handwritten notebook, which was actually maintained by Bradley Edwards' second wife. And this notebook contained detailed records of household activities and financial transactions. And while it might sound really boring and mundane, this is a key thing here because investigators believed that some entries in this book helped establish the timeline and the movements of Edwards relevant to this case, which is obviously very important, particularly dating back to when these crimes did occur. We didn't, really analyze digital things like we do now, and we would rely heavily on things like this. So this is actually very telling. And it highlights something that many people misunderstand about criminal investigations, thanks largely to the CSI effect. Evidence is not always dramatic, you guys, but evidence is evidence. And sometimes the most valuable evidence is incredibly ordinary. It can be in the form of receipts, diaries like we have here, schedules, financial records, telephone records. All of these things, they seem like small pieces of information, but when you combine them together, it really helps in this puzzle for investigators to reconstruct a person's movements and their behaviour and their patterns, their daily routine, I guess. And the real investigations are often built from these seemingly insignificant details. So you'd probably see, pictures on the news of police taking out paper bags of things and think, oh my God, what's in there? What could it be? And it would be things like this. And these are really key pieces to, the trial that ensued. And obviously we still have Sarah Spears, whose case remains unsolved, as they were unable to conclude, I guess, that Bradley Edwards was responsible for the death of Sarah Spears, which is something we'll get into another day because I do have an episode coming up for her. But things, that people on the internet are basically saying like, I wonder what he had and blah, 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 perhaps photographs and things like that. But in this case, no publicly reported evidence presented at trial revealed anything resembling like a shrine or a secret room or anything ridiculous like that. There wasn't a dramatic discovery of a murder room or anything of that nature. No hidden wall, no cavities, victim photographs or things like that. But this is where the reality really diverges from pop culture. And by that, I mean, obviously, mainstream media, because, of course, we have, the CSI effect, TV and movies that basically condition people, or all of us really, to expect that serial killers like this would leave behind obvious signs of their crimes and they would kind of display it as some kind of trophy in one way or another. But many offenders don't do this, and many live what appear to be very ordinary lives. And this is where it comes in a bit of a chat that I've had previously about labeling offenders as monsters and the danger in that, because these are what you would assume to be ordinary people. And that's the danger in these crimes. And the hard part of harm and crime prevention, is recognizing that these are very ordinary people, and they're living very ordinary lives, like going to work, and they're maintaining relationships and paying bills and blending into the community. And this is what makes it so difficult to identify them. Now, if we're talking about the kind of forensic reality in this case, what ultimately brought Bradley Edwards to justice in the Claremont serial killings wasn't what the investigators found inside his home as such, but it's what they found on the victims. Because like I said just before, forensic science is continually evolving, and specifically DNA evidence was evolving. And one of the most significant breakthroughs of this case was the DNA that was recovered beneath Ciara Glennon's fingernails. Now, for years, that evidence existed, but it wasn't tied to a known suspect. But the science simply just hadn't kind of advanced enough to ID who the DNA belonged to until we got to a point where forensic technology had improved to the point where investigators could actually link the DNA under Ciara's fingernails to Bradley Edwards. And that evidence alone became one of the cornerstones of the prosecution case. Now, there was additional forensic evidence which I've spoken about on our episode for the Claremont serial killings, but if you're not familiar, it was the fibre analysis, which ultimately related Edwards' previous sexual offences and kind of linked a vehicle. There was a few other bits and pieces, but it involved ultimately evidence of fibre and fibre being on a victim that had related to Bradley Edwards. And this is one of the reasons that the Claremont investigation is so incredibly significant, I guess you could say, in forensic history, because it demonstrates how evidence collected even decades earlier, so the DNA under Ciara's fingernails, it was retrieved, straight up. But that became critical when technology catches up and evolves. And like I said in the beginning, this is very criminological. It's on the criminology side of my expertise. And with that is a really fascinating aspect of the house search, which is not actually what was found, but more so what wasn't found. And there was no confession or like a diary that detailed the crimes or in that sort of nature, no obvious collection of trophies or murder weapons or anything like that. But investigators actually built their case through forensic evidence, yes, but also behavioural analysis. So that include historical records paired with witness accounts and painstaking work spanning decades. Like this went on and on and on. And this is often how major investigations succeed. And it's not through like one spectacular discovery inside Bradley Edwards' home. It was through thousands of small pieces of evidence that eventually formed a complete picture. And I waffle on about this quite a lot in the podcast, on our social media, about, even with our anonymous tip line, for example, you might have the tiniest bit of information like, oh, I know this missing person and he was once wearing a blue cotton jumper and cargo shorts. Well, you might think that that's completely irrelevant, but we could be sitting here with, some fibers from a blue cotton jumper wondering where this came from and trying to tie that to somebody. Little things like that, they build up a complete picture and they're so incredibly important. And with that comes a huge danger in the expectations that kind of Hollywood has set and the CSI effect. And one lesson I think we can take from the Claremont case is that serial offenders rarely resemble the caricatures that we see on television. Wow, that was awful. People are imagining monsters and people who appear awfully dangerous, and you step inside their home and you instantly know they're a serial killer. It's just not the case. And yeah, it's so dangerous to frame people that way. These are usually quite intelligent people who are, meticulously planning day by day how to maintain relationships for people to see this facade that they're putting on. They're good at fooling people into thinking that they are good, decent people to their core. And the reality is much more unsettling than that. And it's that offenders are, from the onset, they look entirely ordinary. And if you haven't had a look at the pictures online of Bradley Edwards' house when he was arrested, it was an absolute mess. That's about all you're missing out on. But you're not going to scour through these images and see something that prosecutors didn't see or missed out on using in their trial. It's just not going to happen. It was absolutely a mess. It showed, maybe a messy, disorganized man, but with some very ordinary bits and pieces around him. And like I said, the truth will always come to light. It doesn't matter if it's decades later, it's always going to come out. And this has come out by adding, of course, the advances in forensic science, but all of these little bits and pieces saying, this is when he used this bank and he did this transaction here and this here and this here. And then you pair that with witness statements saying, I saw this person here at this time, and all these contradictions start to highlight. And it's just a really powerful reminder that justice is often achieved not through really dramatic revelations, but through persistence and science and determination of investigators and people like myself who just refuse to let a case go cold, which is going to roll into another episode for Sarah Spears, because this is one that is in really high demand, understandably. She was obviously part of the Claremont serial killer case, and they were unable to charge him beyond a reasonable doubt as guilty for anything against Sarah Spears, which is really unfortunate. And, you know, she deserves to be laid to rest and she deserves justice. And it's a case that I get asked about weekly, honestly. You know, there was in the beginning, there was a couple of the same people being like, what about Sarah Spears? And then as time has gone on and we've got a bigger following, there's just more people being like, please don't forget about Sarah Spears. So I want to definitively say, and you can hear me right now, we are not forgetting Sarah Spears. I think this is a really good time to jump into another episode for her. Keeping her name out there and trying to seek justice is always really important, but particularly for loved ones and family members before they pass, because like I've seen recently in the news, Peter Falconio's mother pleading for, not for so much answers in his case, but just to be able to bring his remains home and bury him, you know, before her time is up as well. It's really important. So even though, you know, we get an influx of new cases, all cases are equally important, but it's really important not to forget about these cases that have gone cold because of time. They are statistically more likely to be solved if evidence was retained initially, because with obviously the science progressions, we can do that. There's lots of things, including like what they found in Bradley Edwards' house. You know, thankfully, his second wife who kept all these records, well, little did she know that was going to be incredibly useful when they were prosecuting Edwards. So it is really interesting. I wanted to talk about it because it's something that I like to reiterate every now and again, if not all the time, that offenders are not always monsters. Of course, you know, there's the exception where you're like, oh my gosh, this person was an absolute psychopath and anyone could tell it, but that's very rare. It's usually the case where people almost don't believe that the offender is the actual offender if they know them, because they're like, oh my gosh, I know this person. How could they do this? They would never do this. Like, you know, I thought they were, you know, the best person on earth. That's the case a lot of the time, guys. And that's the scary part about it. And the murders of Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon changed WA, if not Australia, forever, and their families waited so long for answers, and of course Sarah Spears' family is still waiting for answers, and while no conviction can, you know, undo the loss that they experienced, the Claremont case remains one of Australia's most important examples, in my opinion, of how these advances in things like forensic science can finally provide those answers if we are retaining evidence. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode of Exhuming the Truth. If you found this valuable and you enjoyed today or any of our other episodes, please consider following and sharing and supporting the podcast. A little end note before I run away. We have our GoFundMe on our social pages, which is to get, it's an operational fieldwork GoFundMe. So it is to get myself and one other staff member from WA to Queensland, specifically to the Murgon area for, we're hoping 2 to 3 days, if not 4 would be ideal, to get boots on the ground to search for Jack McLennan. We do have another episode for Jack McLennan coming up too, which is essentially my take on the other podcasts that have been made about Jack. And I've got a lot to say about it, and I also have a lot to say about the areas that we're going to be searching and why I'm searching those areas and the work I've been doing behind the scenes to get to these conclusions. I have been working behind the scenes on this case ever since we did our first podcast episode for Jack, which was last year. So I'm excited to share this with you. I know a lot of the things I do might seem a little bit controversial, but I'm not afraid to speak up where I feel someone needs to speak up. So that's kind of what the episode is going to be. You know, that's the direction we'll be going. And my honest opinion about, you know, the placement of Jack's items, where he was last seen and things like that. It's very much an opinion piece, and then a bit of, you know, a professional recon, because I have used our geographical heat mapping to come up with some areas to search there. So yes, our GoFundMe covers flights, vehicle hire, fuel costs, accommodation. It's very bare minimum things that we have covered. I think it was 2,000 we've put there after doing the math. I can't really remember if that's exactly right, but it is like bare minimum cost we put there, and that's like absolutely no profit to us. That's basically just operational costs of getting there and covering the travel and essential requirements for us to be there. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. And as always, stay curious, stay informed, and never stop seeking the truth. And also, I'm going to add, never stop standing up for what you believe to be true, but always be open to have a discussion with somebody who might not be like-minded, because you can learn a lot from that, and that's something that I have learnt too. Be firm and stand your ground, but also allow other people's opinions, allow that conversation, open yourself up to learning new things, and yeah, have a beautiful week.